Synopsis: in a seaside town where folk keep secrets and the harbor collects lost things, Elias Marin, a solitary archivist who catalogs discarded names and forgotten letters, discovers a battered notebook whose entries are shifting overnight. As Elias follows the notebook's migrating memories, he is pulled into the lives of three others: Mara, a woman with a ruined past and a hunger for mending; Jonas, a rain-soaked fisherman haunted by a choice that ended a friendship; and Lila, an 8-year-old whose small, fierce insistence about stories forces Elias to confront his own buried truth. Against the salt and rot of the town, their lives braid into an unexpected reckoning, a quest to retain what was lost, to choose mercy over silence, and to accept that identity is not a single name but a story continually rewritten. The mood is cinematic and intimate, textured with sensory detail, and the story moves from quiet longing to a climactic confrontation that promises either redemption or further erasure. The harbor never looked the same twice. Fog folded itself around the masts like a shawl, then loosened. Gulls argued with the world in bursts of white and black. Crates huddled damply on the quay as if embarrassed to be seen. Elias Marin liked the unpredictability of it. He liked that the sea made its own grammar and the town accepted it, letting meanings dissolve and reappear. Elias made his living in a place that thrived on endings, the municipal archive, where people deposited deeds, the minutes of abandoned committees, and occasionally the odd letter that someone could no longer bear to keep. He called himself an archivist because it paid the bills, but what he kept, when no one watched, was the soft business of names. Not the legal names that bureaucrats loved. Those were neat, serried, filed under codes and microfiche. But the private names, pet names hushed in bedrooms, nicknames scrawled on the back of matchpicks, signatures that had been rubbed out and rewritten. He made boxes for them, folded bits of epistolary life. For my bed, returned to Sam if found. Envelopes that had been opened with a fingernail and then fatalistically refolded. He labeled the boxes not by date but by tone. Regret, hope in small fonts. Anger smelled like cigarettes. His work smelled of paper and lemon oil, of dust warmed by the radiator. It was small and exact and safe. On a Tuesday that began with gulls so loud the town seemed to be arguing with itself, Elias found the notebook. It had been lying in a basket at the back of the archive's donations room, wedged between a child's sweater and a stack of church bulletins. The cover was water-stained and the leather already flat where thumb had traveled so many times the grain had worn threadbare. No name on the front. When he opened it, the ink pages shimmered like fish scales, entries in a tight, nervous hand, dates that looked like they belonged to other lives. The first entry began, "I have given my name away to the sea." It was dated October 9th, 2 years ago. Elias expected a confession, a draft of a diary. Instead, the entry read like a map. Small observations: a woman sweeping at dawn, a child's laughter through the wall, the smell of wood smoke, and then a line that teased him with impossibility. If you find this, retain what you can. Names have weight. He frowned and turned the page. The next entry was about a boy with green shoes who sold pebbles at the pier. The handwriting wavered, then steadied. At the top of that page a different date had been stamped by someone else in a different, heavier hand. Elias felt the familiar stir, curiosity opening like a flower. He slipped the book into his coat and went to the tea room on the corner, where he kept his coffee card and a small window to the street. There he would read, properly, as if the notebook were the sort of thing that ought to be read with a biscuit and a proper cup. By the time the rain started that afternoon, the notebook had changed. At first Elias thought it was his mistake. He read an entry about Jonas Weller, a fisherman whose name came with a small photograph stuck beneath the paragraph, salted at the edges. Jonas's name was familiar. Every harbor town carried a Jonas or two, men with calloused hands and regret in the hollows of their cheeks. The photograph, though, was a photograph Elias had never seen. A man with storm-gray hair, smiling with the dissonant and comfortable grin of someone who has loved badly. The paragraph described the night someone had left a candle on the cliff path, and the way a gull fell into the lantern light like a white coin. He closed the notebook and reopened it, as though the act could straighten whatever small wrinkle the world had gained. The entry was now about Mara, a woman with knuckles like old bread and a laugh that came out too loud in small rooms. Then, suddenly, the lines of ink blurred and a new line slid between them, as if written on a different day. "I am not the person my father's ledger says I am." Elias looked at his hands, which bore faint scars from a childhood of curious fingers that once learned the language of sharp objects. He had never been the type of man to believe in books with reputations for magic. Still, he felt a small pulse of recognition you get when an attic door opens and a cool unknown breathes out. He had been an archivist for 10 years, and in 10 years he had learned that what people forget is never wholly gone. It lingers in the margins until someone with the patience to notice brings it back into the light. The next morning Lila came to the archive before the school bell. She was 8, with braids that smelled faintly of daisies. She'd been coming to Elias's desk since she was 5, a regular pilgrim to a place where words were kept in boxes like rare birds. Her mother worked at the fish market and her father had left before Lila could remember his own name properly. Lila wanted to be an inventor of words. She believed words could be fixed into jars like fireflies and saved for bad nights. "Did you find any lost endings?" she asked, placing both palms on the desk as if to anchor the question. Elias showed her the notebook. Lila peered at it, tongue between her teeth like a sculptor finding a block of stone. "Names?" she asked. "They shift," Elias said. He felt like a person admitting a small, private sin. Lila didn't flinch. "Then maybe we can help them," she declared. "Names are people who forgot how to stand." She had a way of talking that made the world seem more literal and more malleable. Her insistence had shifted Elias before. He had agreed to things he would have once laughed off because of her. So he opened the book again. This time the ink spoke of Mara at length. Mara lived above the old tailor's shop in an apartment that smelled of mothballs and lemon. She mended coats for a living, stitching other people's stories together so their lives stayed warm. People whispered about her, that she'd been in prison once, that she had thrown a cup at a man who had been too small for forgiveness, that she had tried to keep a dead bird warm under her bra. These were the sort of rumors that had the shine of truth precisely because they were broken. The notebook, however, showed us the small mechanics of Mara's days, her careful counting of stitches, the way she whispered directions to the radio, the way she kept a coin under her pillow for emergencies. It didn't begin with accusation. It began with tenderness and a single decisive line. "I will not be catalogued into one shame." Elias felt his heart knock. To name a person as not a single shame was a kind of defiance. He had filed many things under shame. It was a neat box with a lid. Mara wanted out of the box. He sat back and listened to the rain tick at the windows, and a sense of possibility, slow and beaded as a line of condensation, formed. He and Lila began to test the book's edges. When they read a passage, sometimes the ink darkened, sometimes a new paragraph appeared, like a footnote from a future that wanted to be. They learned not to read aloud everything at once, because once read the notebook seemed to triangulate the name to the person nearby. When Jonas's name emerged, Elias found him at the harbor, smoking an old cigarette with a broken lighter and a boat that had the kind of lean that suggested a history of being pushed too far. His face carried weather like a familiar map. "You're Elias," Jonas said before Elias could introduce himself. "You keep other people's ghosts in boxes." Elias nodded. He had no tidy answer. Jonas's eyes were the color of storm glass. "What do you want?" "Forget I asked." Jonas lowered his voice. "We all do this living thing wrong. I once made a choice and someone I loved left and He didn't finish." The harbor seemed to hold its breath. Elias had catalogued grief many times. It usually came with a name on the envelope and a return address that was no longer resolvable. But Jonas's grief was different. It arrived in a form of regret that had teeth. He had been part of a small, changeable crew once. 3 men who were friends since childhood, Jonas, Marek, and a third whose name had been a hammer-down, Thomas. Whatever had happened between them happened deep and fast, like a sudden rip in a net. Marek was gone. Thomas had left town. Jonas's voice turned thin at the edge where stories end. "He came for the boat the night I lit the wrong lantern," Jonas said. If onlys were currency in this town." Elias felt their weight, like coins in a sock. Jonas pushed a photograph across the table. A teenage Marek with 2 big teeth and a face full of day. Beneath the photograph, in the edge of Jonas's own handwriting, was a single note. "Forgive me." Forgiveness was not a thing you could hand over like a hat. It had the smell of someone washing a shirt until the pattern went away. Still, Elias felt the pull. The notebook had shifted and given him the map. If names were people, perhaps forgiveness was the road they walked back home. Mara did not want to be saved. She wanted to be seen on her own terms. She did not ask for explanations, only small acknowledgments. When Elias knocked on her door, she opened it with the bluntness of someone who had practiced disappointing the world. The apartment inside was a precise jumble, a sewing machine with a chipped enamel sign, half-mended coats on pegs, jars of buttons like a small city. She motioned him in and listened while he told her, haltingly, about the notebook. "I've kept my hands busy so my mind won't wander to what I did," she said, fingers working on a cuff as if the cuff could be turned into an argument in one. "People say things. People write things. They think the story is finished and they throw away the book." "Do you want it?" Elias asked. Mara's eyes flicked to his hands. "Is it the kind of thing you can retain?" "It's not a thing," Lila said, as if she had been in the doorway the whole time. "It's a set of soft footprints. Maybe it needs the right feet to fit them." Mara laughed then, a small sound like pipes warming in winter. She thought of her listless conviction that she was not a single shame. The notebook made that possibility tangible. She said, "All right. Then let's see if a handful of names remembers how to be decent." They started small. Elias, Lila, Mara, and in fits and starts Jonas met at odd hours, reading the book and then opening their mouths into the world. The notebook seemed almost to crave the network. The reading of it altered the narratives it held, not by overwriting but by offering new margins. A sentence would append itself with a lighter hand. "He loved the way the summer tasted like peaches," and someone in the group would recognize the image and then find the person who had once said it. The town, which had grown used to its own small cruelties, bristled faintly at first and then softened like leather left in the sun. People who had thought themselves unworthy of their history started to find, in the margins of the day, items to claim. A letter tucked behind a tile, a photograph slid into a drawer. The notebook led them to these things like a metal detector. Some items were ornate with the weight of meaning. Some were as small as a child's note with "I love you," mum written in crayon. Each return deflated the town's long-edged habit of making a person's whole life equivalent to a single catastrophic act. Yet the notebook had its own appetite. The more they read and returned, the stranger its entries became. At times it wrote in third person about Elias as if it had known him all his life. "He keeps names the way others keep bones." Elias felt exposed and chastened. The book focused on what he would not let himself remember. His mother's hands working the kettle until it whistled. The time he had broken a neighbor's window with a stone and then folded the apology into a paper crane. The way he log-rolled grief into catalogs rather than allowing it to live in him. There was one entry he did not show the others, a line that had appeared overnight in a handwriting that was not the book's usual tremor. It read simply, "Find the ledger in the churchyard. It will know the name you lost." Elias's blood went cold. He had a name he had buried like a coin in the garden. The name of a boy who had been part of a risky midnight ride years earlier, whose fall Elias had always considered partly his fault. The ledger the book mentioned was a parish list, a record of baptisms and burials that might, if read in the right light, confess the things the town had forgotten to say aloud. He told himself he would not open old wounds. He told himself he was an archivist, not a provocateur. But the town had already been moving in the current the notebook created, and he felt, with fearful clarity, that to stop now would be another kind of erasure. The churchyard was a slow place, full of lichen and the softened faces of stone angels. Elias knelt and ran his fingers over the ledger he had found in a hollow between the vestry and a box of hymnals. It was a list of names in a fountain pen blue that had sunk into the paper like rain. Near the end, in handwriting he did not recognize and with an ink blot that looked like a tear, was the name he had not said aloud in a decade, Thomas Weller. Elias's throat closed. He realized his entire life had been an attempt to file away one misstep. He had kept himself busy cataloging others' sins to distract from his own. The ledger offered a different arrangement, the possibility that names, once found, could be returned intact rather than filed under guilty. He understood then that the notebook's real demand was not to rewrite the past, but to place it in the light so people could look at it plainly and then choose what to do with it. The wound Jonas carried widened into a revelation. Thomas Weller, Marek's friend, Jonas's companion, was alive, his name recorded as having been buried in another town's parish records under a different year. The ledger suggested that the story Jonas had held for years was incomplete. Marek's disappearance had not ended with death but with movement. Someone had, perhaps, taken Thomas to another life. If this was true, Jonas's forgive me had more options than sorrow could afford. Jonas, when he heard the ledger's news, Looked as if he'd been struck by wind. "If he lives, why did no one tell me?" he asked. Rage and relief braided in his voice. "Why would someone let me carry this like a stone?" "Because people are cowards," Mara said, her voice ablade. "Because it's easier to write a death than admit you moved someone." They tracked the records. The notebook, now a kind of compass, led them to a registrar in a coastal town down the line, to a nurse who had once been a midwife and remembered a frightened man with a child's name folded into his jacket. They followed clues like threads. Sometimes the trail dissolved, but often it led somewhere small and stubborn. An old woman who kept a photograph of Thomas with a boy holding a slingshot, a letter addressed to Thomas, who left his name at sea. Wherever they went, Elias watched Lila watch. She would stand in doorways, sucking her thumb until the answers came. The child's presence made things soft at the edges, as if magic required an audience small enough to believe the extraordinary had the right to happen. The climactic afternoon arrived in the form of a gray day that tasted of metal. They reached an abandoned boathouse, its timbers sagging like tired elders. The air inside was sharp with salt and the smell of old rope. In a pocket of an upturned creel they found a scarf, and in the scarf a slip of paper. Thomas's handwriting, shaky but unmistakable, with a date and a place. It placed Thomas in a shelter 3 towns over, under a different surname, widowed into a life built by necessity. They found him in a small room with curtains that let in the light like soft coins. Thomas's hair had gone white. His hand trembled when he raised it to the teacup Jonas offered. For a moment legalities and old accusations felt like a tangle of seaweed. Thomas looked at Jonas and then at Elias and seemed to recognize them both as men whose youthful appetite had come due. "Jonas," he said, his voice like paper, "you shouldn't have come here." "Why didn't you write?" Jonas asked. The years of hunger sharpened into a knife. Thomas's eyes moved across them all. "I did not know where to put my name back down. When you pushed, I was afraid. I didn't know how to be the thing you expected me to be. So I changed my name and became quieter. I thought if I gave my name away it would stop hurting." The confession landed like a rain-thin sound. Jonas's body folded in on itself and then straightened. He moved forward and put out his hand. Not for a handshake, but for a man who had once been a brother. Thomas hesitated, then took it. The movement was small and absolute. Afterwards, the town hummed with a new vocabulary. The notebook was full of entries about small reconciliations, sentences that read like birds returning to their nests. Elias realized that they had been doing more than restoring names. They had been assembling a kind of map for how to accept people who had changed. People came to the archive, not to bury themselves but to be read aloud. Someone sang at the market. Another family returned a photograph that had been hidden in a drawer. A man who had been called a coward for 40 years stood at the key and apologized to Marek's mother, who nodded and then, unexpectedly, took his hands in his and said, "I have been making do with my anger. Perhaps it is time to make do with patience." There was one difficult morning when the notebook, in its blunt way, asked the hardest question. It wrote to Elias directly, "Will you return the name you once lost?" The ledger in the churchyard had been a mirror. Now the book was asking him to step into the light he'd offered others. He thought of the boy who had fallen from the cliff, of the weight of a life that had thinned out like water in a sieve. He thought of the way he'd filed names into boxes labeled regret and forgiveness as though life could be tidied that way. He thought of Lila, who would run her fingers along the corners of things like a person learning the shape of the world. Elias went to the cliff at dawn. The light was chipped and pale. He stood where the path dipped and watched the sea glue itself to the horizon. He said the name aloud, the only thing he had not done for years. His voice broke. He did not expect release. He expected only the honest knowledge of having said it. But as the syllable left him, the air changed. It felt less like a confession and more like placing a stone back into the riverbed. He did not know whether that river would carry it away or let it settle. The world did not rearrange itself for him alone. But a small thing did happen. His chest unknotted in a manner that felt like mercy. When he returned to the archive, the notebook had a new entry written in a hand that thrilled him with its familiarity. "Names are not prisons," it read. "They are rooms. You can lock them, you can keep them open, or you can step into them and paint the walls." Elias pinned the book back into its box. Lila came in skipping, pockets full of pebbles she had decided were important enough to be kept in a jar. Mara laughed in a way that suggested the world had been ransacked and someone had left a note saying, "Keep a few things." Jonas walked in quieter than before. Not unhurt, but less like a man carrying an anvil. They all sat, a patched constellation of people who had been found and who had found each other. The town, which had been efficient in erasing the messy part of its life, now kept a different ledger, one of returns. People learned that a name was not a verdict, but an ongoing project. They learned that forgiveness was not always the romantic exoneration offered by novels. Sometimes it was the small work of showing up, of naming someone in the way they wished to be named, even when it was inconvenient. In the final pages of the notebook there was an entry written by Lila in a child's hand, very small and very sure. Names were lonely. We brought friends. Elias smiled until his face ached. He turned the last page and found, beneath the ink, a single pressed daisy. The daisy rested in a thin film of the notebook's life as if it had been collected on purpose, a token left by someone who believed in the smallness of gestures. Elias lifted it, then taped it to the inside cover. The archive's light slanted across the desk like a benediction. Outside, the harbor kept doing what harbors do, collecting things, letting some go. Inside, Elias and the others were learning how to live with names that could be more than the worst thing anyone had ever called them. And somewhere in the city, in a forgotten room warmed by kettle, a faded ledger sighed open and exhaled the shape of a man who could finally say his name and mean it without the taste of the sea at the back of his mouth. The town, in its small, accidental way, had learned to listen. The notebook, now lighter for its stories, settled into a new rhythm, not as an oracle but as an act of neighboring, a device for the humane administration of memory. The entry slowed. People no longer knocked on Elias's desk to absolve or be absolved. They came to be noticed, to have their names said back to them as if they were a line of music to be heard. Sometimes, in the evenings when the wind shaped the harbor into a single long breath, Elias would walk down to the quay and watch the sea trade light with the sky. Lila would sometimes tag along, her braid like a small flag. Mara would appear with a scarf around her neck and a bag of buttons to trade. Jonas would join them, carrying the soft, awkward smile of a man who had been given back a brother. They would stand and listen to the gulls and the waves and the town breathing. The notebook sat quietly on Elias's shelf, full of names that had been spoken and lives that had been rearranged by the act of being recognized. In the end, the town's ledger did not become perfect. People still made mistakes, they still catalogued and misfiled and sometimes hurt one another because grief is clumsy. But the book had changed the grammar of their forgiveness. It taught them that names are rooms you can paint if you choose, and that retaining a name, even when it is only a small thing like a photograph or a letter, was not a grand finale but the start of an ongoing conversation. Elias, who had once treated names as inventory, learned to hold them as conversations. He learned that the sea could take many things, but it could not keep a story that someone insisted on telling. He learned to say the name he had kept in his pocket for years, and to let the syllable fall where it would. Outside the archive, the harbor would continue to gather and release. Inside, the book rested with its daisy pressed to the cover, a little proof that sometimes the simplest objects, a scrap of paper, a child's insistence, a found ledger, were enough to begin mending the torn, honest world.